Alright, well, the power steering pump is off. The 2006 Ford Focus here, the 2-liter engine. Power steering pump mounts right in that location, those 4 bolts right there. I'll show you over here on the pump exactly how it mounts. It's a lot easier to take a video of it out of the vehicle than in. The big thing you need to know is that lower line right there, that's a threaded fitting. So to take this out, you're going to need 10mm socket for those 4 bolts that hold it on, and that fitting down there is an 18mm right there, and it spins on the metal pipe, and so you can just unthread it from the bottom of the pump. To get it free, you need to remove that fitting first before you can get at that lower bolt down there. The top 2 come off to start with, and the upper hose gets disconnected. The upper hose I've tucked out of the way right there from the top, from the reservoir on top. So those 2 top bolts hold the reservoir on, and then there's a rubber hose, that one right there with just a spring clamp. You use a pair of pliers, then the reservoir comes off. Next would be that lower fitting down there, unthreads. Then you can get those bottom 2 bolts, and you can pull the whole pump off. It's pretty simple. So for taking it off, you need a 10mm socket, an 18mm wrench, and a pair of pliers. That's all you're going to need. Obviously the belt needs to come off. I'll show you over here why the belt was already off of this one. When I say this car needed a new power steering pump, there's the old power steering pump right there. The person actually ran it until the shaft seized inside and snapped off. There's the pulley. There's the shaft. The shaft, of course, should be in this side of the pump over here. That nasty bore that's just completely destroyed. So there's the pump. There's the 4 bolts that bolted to the front of the engine block. And the reservoir sits right over here. So if we take this, we mock it up the way it is on the car. It sits in there right like this. The reservoir has a fitting right there. That fitting slides into the pump with those 2 seals, and those 2 bolts right up there hold the reservoir in place. So you take those 2 bolts out, you take the hose that goes off that end of the reservoir, and you just pop it out like that. There's the fitting with the 2 O-rings. You're going to get new ones of those with the new pump. So that'll be next. I'll pull a new pump out of the package, and we'll go from there. Okay, so I got my reservoir all spiffied up and shiny. I've got my brand new pump right here, fresh out of the box. Now, the pulley needs to be put on before the pump's put in, obviously. Your pulley's going to go on your shaft like so, and you're going to have to use something like this right here. It's a pump install tool. A pulley install tool used on most power steering pumps. Chevy uses the same one. It threads in just like this. It's going to thread into your shaft. Get that nice and tight. Then you're going to spin this down like this. And you're going to use a wrench on there. You're going to hold that tight, put a wrench on here, and push this pulley down on. Now, since I don't have a stand out here, I'm not going to be able to film that as far as I can tell, but I'm going to stick it on there. It's important to know you do not want to use a press. You don't want to use a hammer. Both of those things are going to damage that shaft and damage the seals inside the pump. Okay, so what you're looking for, once you get that pulley crank down on there, it'll stop. See the pulley shaft? The pulleys are designed that tool only press it down there until it's level, basically, with that. It's got a little depression there, but that's where it stopped. The tool got tight, it didn't push on any farther, and that means your pulley is properly seated down on your shaft. It's not hitting anything. It's spinning really nice. There it is. So we're going to go and put this pulley on the car, install that lower fitting into it, and then the reservoir goes on top once we get the pulley installed. That lower fitting does come with a new Teflon washer. You need to heat that Teflon washer up in a pan of warm water. stretch it out nice and safely on a tapered punch of some type, and then it'll help you slide it over the threads on the fitting where it needs to go. And I'll try to show you guys that. Okay, so there's my can of hot water. Use that on the Teflon seal. If you can see it, the Teflon seal is right there on this threaded fitting. So I put it in the hot water, then I use a taper punch here, and I slid it up the taper punch all the way onto the thickest part. Then I stuck that back in the hot water, like so, to heat the Teflon seal up more, to keep it hot, because when it's hot it's pliable, when it gets cold it's not. Then I slid it off and popped it on the top of there, and I actually had to chase it down all the way around with my fingers. Chase it round and round and round and run it down the threads to get the seat all the way at the bottom. So make sure you do that. Be careful with it. It's easy to break them or cut them on those threads. So there's the Teflon seal. Now I'm going to grab the pump, put the pump back on the bottom bolts back in there. There's 4 bolts. They're all 10 millimeter and they're all the same length, so you can't mess that up. Okay, so there's our pump. We got that mounted. That lower fitting is down underneath there, past the pressure switch right here. The pressure switch threads in. The lower fitting's underneath there. Really tricky to get at, I found out, with the pulley installed. It was easy coming out because the pulley was obviously fell off this thing. So putting that fitting on, I had to take that pressure switch, that power steering pressure switch right there, I had to take that out, unthread it, so I could get a little stubby wrench underneath there and turn things a quarter turn at a time until that fitting threaded in. Not much fun. The pump did come with an O-ring seal for that pressure switch. So once I took it out, I was able to put a new O-ring seal on it and then thread it back in. So that pressure switch has a hex bolt, a hex flats on it down here underneath this part. So right down in there, you can put a 14 millimeters wrench on that and you can loosen it up to get it out. So we got the 2 lower bolts on this pump are installed. That's what's holding it in place. Now we're going to take our reservoir, 2 new O-ring seals on there. They came with the pump kit. We're going to take this down in here, right? Get a shot of this. There's our pump. This slides into that hole right there. Pop it in place like that. And now we've got those 2 bolts, one back there, and the other one's back there. And take and slide those 2 bolts in. Then the pump's going to be installed. All I'm going to have to do is put the serpentine belt on. Always a challenge, of course, on these laterally transverse mounted front engine cars because the belt is wedged down through there. The tensioner pulley is back down there. Yeah, right there. So, you know, not easy usually to snake those things in, but we're going to get all that put together next. And then I'll fire it up. Should be fixed, ready to roll. We'll see. So in true mechanic fashion, I got the pump all installed. Went to put the belt on. No easy task to weasel it down in there. And the belt was not the right one. So, of course, the parts store was closed by that point. I had to wait till the next day. They don't have the right belt. So it's on order. Any rate, while I was waiting for that, I decided, why don't I fill up the reservoir? And when I filled up the reservoir here, which is right on the top, of course, took a step away and noticed all of the power steering fluid was leaking out the bottom of the car. So, thankfully, it's not too tricky of a fix, but I cut that line. That line had a chafe in it. It had been rubbing on the radiator right over there, and it worn a hole in it. And it was all just pouring out the bottom. So that's why the power steering pump went bad. There was a leak down here. and all the power steering fluid was just leaking everywhere. It made a giant mess underneath here of everything. Thankfully I discovered that before I started the car up. But at any rate, today it's the fix for that. And the fix for that is going to be, hopefully, a compression fitting. Compression fittings are pretty simple. They got a sleeve in there. This is a compression junction. That pipe is 3/8 in diameter. So I'm going to throw this on, fill it back up with fluid, and hopefully that's going to fix our problem, I hope. Stay tuned. We'll see. All right, well, it's finally all back together. There's the belts on there, everything's running. And what I did for that line in front that was leaking, the compression fitting didn't work because there's a coating on that line. So what I ended up doing was putting a chunk of reinforced rubber hose, 2 hose clamps. That is a return line, so there's not pressure on it, just feeding fluid back to the pump reservoir. So that's going to work just fine. I'd rather use a compression fitting, but there's a coating on those lines which makes them slightly bigger than the 3/8 compression fitting. And the coating's real tough, real difficult to get off, so I just went with a simple route. But at any rate, there she is. Now it's time for a little bit of a road test. Take her out, run around the block a few times, and it should be ready to go. I'm probably going to get rid of this thing in a little bit. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Leave comments below. Anybody has any suggestions for this? It's pretty straightforward, but just another project. There'll be more to come. Like I said, I got another truck on the way that somebody's offering up to me and needs a clutch change, so that'll be in the future.